So I started going for gold camo on the fighting knife, and melee it just feels terrible after playing Black Ops Cold War for a year. So I went and looked into melee to see if there was any way that you could make the melee experience better, and I discovered that pretty much every other way that you can melee in this game is better than meleeing with the fighting knife, which is pathetic because the fighting knife, that's what it specializes in, is melee. That's its only sole purpose, and it's not even that good at it. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing what I found about the fast melee and reach melee perks, as well as the bayonet and our star of this video, the throwing knife. If you didn't know, if you equip the throwing knife in your lethal slot, you will actually melee with the throwing knife instead of the butt of your weapon. And it will actually be a one-hit kill, just like it was in older Call of Duty games, rather than being a two-hit if you were to do it with the butt of your weapon. If you throw your throwing knife, you will revert to using the butt of your weapon to melee, but as long as you have a throwing knife in stock, you will actually knife with your throwing knife. And as I kind of hinted towards in the beginning of this video, the throwing knife is just as good, if not better, than the fighting knife itself. There are multiple ways you can improve the throwing knife melee that you just can't do with the fighting knife, which makes the fighting knife irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. But there are some downsides and some bugs you should be aware of if you decide to use throwing knives instead of the fighting knife for melee, and that's what we're going to discuss in the remainder of this video. But if you take just one thing away from this video, let it be that the throwing knife is a one-hit melee kill no matter what class you put it on, as long as you have one available in your lethal slot. And that makes it a pretty attractive lethal equipment. I mean, thermites and incendiaries are arguably the best and the only things you should be using in Vanguard at the moment. But if you're doing a close quarters combat class, or you just don't need the zoning utility that those fire grenades offer, the throwing knife is a very solid choice for a lethal. Now, there are two areas I want to explore further with melee and the throwing knife in this video. We have melee speed and melee range, which are both stats that you can change with perks and attachments, and also change depending on what melee weapon you're actually using. As for melee speed, the fighting knife swings at a rate of about 60 melees per minute, which is actually really slow, and one of the reasons it feels really bad. The bayonet will swing at the same rate, but the throwing knife melees much faster. It swings about 95 melees per minute. That's a rough estimate because if you're button spamming melee in this game, it tends to be a bit wonky in terms of registering an input, so I just rounded the numbers for easiest of this video. But yeah, the throwing knife can actually get kills and get follow-up kills faster than the fighting knife, which, again, as I said in the beginning of this video, is pretty pathetic. And you'll see the more we talk about the fighting knife, the more pathetic it gets throughout this video. Before we get into Commando Lunge, there is a perk, a weapon perk in this game called Fast Melee. This perk does not work for the throwing knife. It only applies to the weapons that are equipped on themselves. It will speed up the two-hit kill with that weapon, but to be honest, it's a pretty useless perk attachment, and you're going to be better off using the throwing knife for that one-hit kill. The other melee perk, Reach, is a different story. Let's take a look at the ranges for these melee weapons before we add Reach into the equation. The fighting knife looks to be a bit shorter than the throwing knife, the gun butt, and the bayonet, which all share the same melee range, but it's not short by that much. They're actually very similar. I would just call these the same, to be honest with you. The throwing knife, the gun butts, and the bayonet attachment all have access to the Reach melee perk, which the fighting knife does not have access to. And the Reach melee perk simply extends your lunge range for melee. I believe this perk is available for every primary and secondary weapon in the game that takes attachments. And you can see this extends your range pretty far out to the range you're seeing on the screen right now. And yes, I want to reiterate, this does work for the throwing knife. The fighting knife can't do this. So not only does the throwing knife have a faster melee speed, it is also more effective at range if you make a class that takes advantage of the Reach weapon perk. Now, there are some caveats to the Reach and throwing knife combo. Reach will only apply to the throwing knife if the weapon with the kit is in your hand. If the weapon with Reach is stowed, it will not work. So if you have Reach on one gun and not the other, make sure you're conscious of what weapon is equipped at the time and which one is stowed. Spamming the throwing knife also seems to prevent reach from activating. I'll throw some footage on the screen right now of me testing the range, and I'm like spamming the knife, trying to move closer and closer, which is usually how I test range, and it just didn't seem to work. But if you take a brief pause in between each swing, the reach perk will activate and work every time. Not sure if this is bugged or intended. It's definitely wonky, so if you're making classes with the reach and the throwing knife, this is just something to be aware of while you're actually using it in a game. The throwing knife also cancels the bayonet entirely. I mean, you can still charge with the bayonet and go through that whole sprinting animation, but when you get to the enemy, you just put your bayonet down and still end up meleeing with your throwing knife. It seems like a bug, but I have no clue though, so I advise to avoid using the bayonet and the throwing knife together, at least for meleeing at the moment. And lastly, although the throwing knife has a lot going for it in terms of like everything melee, the fighting knife still has an edge in terms of time to kill. If you swing both the fighting knife and the throwing knife at the same exact time, the fighting knife will register a kill about 50 to 75 milliseconds faster than the throwing knife. This looks great for the fighting knife on paper, but in practice, the odds of this happening are really low, so it's not that much of an advantage to the fighting knife. If we're looking at like 150 milliseconds, maybe it'll feel different, but just something you should be aware of if you opt to use the throwing knife. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think the fighting knife needs a buff, being that its sole purpose is melee, or do you think this is intentional game design? Personally, I can actually see it being intentional, just so there's a reason to use something other than thermites and incendiary grenades in this game because they're so powerful. But I don't know. Share your thoughts in a comment. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, please tap that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. I upload tons of Vanguard content weekly on this channel. So if you like what you see, consider subscribing. And if you'd like to help support the channel directly, there's some links down below at the bottom of the description that you can check out. Catch you on the next one. Peace.